Doctors, have you ever had a patient that refused to get better? Nathan's mother burst into my office sobbing uncontrollably. He's getting worse again. You have to save my baby. Please, I can't lose him. I'd been treating Nathan for 6 months now, and his case had become the most frustrating of my career. He would improve in the hospital, then mysteriously relapse every time he went home. We'd tested for everything from rare genetic disorders to environmental toxins, but found no clear cause for his recurring symptoms. Nathan presented with severe gastrointestinal distress, dehydration, and weakness. We'd get him stabilized with intravenous fluids and medications, then send him home with strict dietary guidelines. His mother, Elise, always followed our instructions perfectly, even keeping detailed food logs. Yet within days, he'd be back in the emergency room. I decided to admit Nathan for extended observation. We needed to monitor everything that went into his body and track his symptoms in real time. Elise was allowed to stay in his room, and she never left his side. She slept on the uncomfortable chair and only ate when nurses forced her to take breaks. During his hospital stay, Nathan thrived. His color returned and he started playing with toys again. The nurses adored him because he was so polite despite feeling sick. After 2 weeks with no symptoms, I felt confident enough to discuss discharge. Elise's face went pale when I mentioned sending him home. "Are you absolutely sure he's ready?" she asked with trembling hands. "What if it happens again?" I assured her we'd continue monitoring him closely as an outpatient. We scheduled follow-up appointments and gave her my direct number for emergencies. She hugged Nathan so tight he complained she was squishing him. Something about her desperation made me uneasy, but I attributed it to normal parental anxiety. 3 days later, Nathan was back. Elise carried him into the ER barely conscious with severe vomiting and diarrhea. We ran the same battery of tests and again found nothing specific. His symptoms matched food poisoning, but Elise swore she'd only given him approved foods from our list. This pattern continued for months. Hospital stays where Nathan improved, followed by rapid decline at home. I consulted with specialists across the country who were equally baffled. We tested their home for mold, checked their water supply, even had Elise switch all their cookware in case of metal contamination. Elise started breaking down more frequently. She'd sob in the hallways, begging us not to give up on her son. She brought home cooked meals to show us exactly what Nathan was eating. Simple foods like chicken soup and rice that shouldn't cause such severe reactions. She was the picture of a devoted mother watching her child suffer. During Nathan's 5th admission, I decided to take a different approach. Instead of focusing on what might be wrong with Nathan, I started observing Elise more closely. She was always present, always helpful, always asking questions about his treatment. But there were small things that didn't add up. She seemed to know exactly when Nathan would get sick, often bringing him in before the worst symptoms started. She was reluctant to leave him alone with nurses despite exhaustion. Most tellingly, she always insisted on feeding him herself, even when he was capable of eating independently. I quietly ordered some additional tests without telling Elise. Specifically, I requested toxicology screens for substances we wouldn't normally check. The results came back showing trace amounts of syrup of ipecac, an emetic that induces vomiting. It was an old remedy no longer recommended but still available online. My blood ran cold as I realized what this meant. I called Child Protective Services and hospital security before confronting Elise. I needed to be absolutely certain before making such a serious accusation. We arranged for Nathan to receive all meals from hospital staff, only while documenting Elise's reaction. Elise became increasingly agitated when told she couldn't bring Nathan food from home. She argued it was the only thing he could keep down and accused us of not understanding his needs. When we held firm, she tried sneaking food in her purse. Security found homemade cookies that tested positive for ipecac. I had to sit down when the full weight hit me. Elise had been deliberately poisoning her son for months. Every hospital stay, every test, every tearful breakdown had been part of an elaborate deception. But I still didn't understand why a mother would do this to her child. Child Services interviewed Elise while Nathan remained under protective custody in the hospital. She initially denied everything, but eventually broke down when presented with evidence. Through her sobs, she told a story that made my stomach turn, even though part of me understood her twisted logic. Elise's husband, Wayne, was abusive. "You don't understand," she cried. "Wayne gets angry when Nathan makes noise or doesn't obey immediately. I've seen what he does to me. I couldn't let him hurt my baby anymore. That's why I did what cost me my medical license next." I looked at Elise sobbing in my office chair and reached for my phone to call Brooke McIntyre at Child Protective Services. My hands shook as I dialed the emergency number they'd given me for after-hours cases. Brooke answered on the second ring, and I told her everything Elise had just confessed about Wayne's abuse. I explained that Elise had been poisoning Nathan to keep him safe from his father, and now we had a bigger problem than we thought. Brooke said she'd be there within the hour with her team and told me to keep Elise calm until they arrived. I hung up and grabbed tissues for Elise, who was still crying and mumbling about how she couldn't let Wayne hurt Nathan. She kept repeating that nobody understood what Wayne was capable of when he got angry. I sat across from her and watched her rock back and forth in the chair while we waited. 40 minutes later, Brooke walked through my office door with 2 other CPS workers and a police officer. They needed to interview Elise formally about Wayne's abuse, but she could barely speak through her tears. She grabbed Brooke's arm and begged her not to let Wayne take Nathan. The police officer started recording while one of the CPS workers tried to calm Elise down enough to answer questions. Elise kept saying Wayne would kill her if he found out she told anyone about the abuse. She showed them old bruises on her arms that were turning yellow and green. The CPS workers took photos, while Elise explained how Wayne would grab her when Nathan cried too much. After an hour of trying to get a clear statement, I pulled Brooke out into the hallway to talk privately. I told her my biggest fear was that Wayne would get custody of Nathan, while Elise faced charges for the poisoning. Brooke nodded and said she shared that concern, but the legal system had rules they had to follow. She explained that getting an emergency protective order could take days or even weeks, depending on the judge. The court would need proof of Wayne's abuse beyond just Elise's word, especially since she'd been caught poisoning their child. I asked if there was any way to keep Nathan in the hospital until we figured this out. Brooke said she'd file the paperwork first thing in the morning, but couldn't promise anything would happen quickly. That night I went home, but couldn't sleep knowing Wayne could show up at any moment demanding his son. I drove back to the hospital at 2 in the morning and sat in my office reviewing Nathan's charts. I searched through 6 months of medical records looking for any legitimate reason to keep him hospitalized longer. His latest blood work showed he was recovering well from the ipecac poisoning, but I needed something else. I checked his weight charts and noticed he was still slightly underweight for his age. It wasn't enough to require hospitalization, but maybe I could stretch it into a reason for observation. I made notes in his file about potential nutritional deficiencies that needed monitoring. The next morning, I was already at my desk when my phone rang at 7:30. Security told me a man named Wayne was in the lobby with a lawyer demanding to see his son. My stomach dropped as I called Marshall Bishop, the hospital administrator, to handle the situation. Marshall told security to keep them in the lobby, while he called an emergency meeting in the conference room. I rushed down to find Marshall already there with 3 members of the hospital legal team. Marshall started the meeting by explaining that Wayne had parental rights since he wasn't the one who poisoned Nathan. The lawyer with Wayne was threatening to sue the hospital for denying a father access to his sick child. My hands shook as I argued that sending Nathan home with an abuser was just trading one danger for another. I told them about Elise's bruises and her claims that Wayne hurt her when Nathan made noise. Marshall looked sympathetic, but said we couldn't act on accusations without proper documentation. The hospital legal team sided with Marshall, explaining that denying parental access without a court order could open us up to lawsuits. They said Wayne had every legal right to see his son and potentially take him home if Nathan was medically cleared. One lawyer suggested we could only intervene if we witnessed Wayne being violent or threatening in the hospital. I walked to the window and watched Wayne pacing in the lobby 4 floors below. His face looked calm, but I could see his fists clenching and unclenching as he waited. His lawyer kept checking his watch and making phone calls while Wayne stared at the elevator doors. I made an excuse about needing to check on Nathan's morning vitals and left the meeting. Instead of going to the nurse's station, I went straight to Nathan's room on the pediatric floor. He was sitting up in bed coloring in a dinosaur book while the morning nurse checked his IV. Nathan looked up at me with a big smile and asked when his mommy would visit him today. The nurse said he'd been asking about her all morning and didn't understand why she hadn't come yet. I told Nathan his mom needed to rest, but would try to visit soon. He went back to coloring while I watched him, this sweet kid who had no idea his father was downstairs trying to take him. My phone buzzed with a text from Brooke saying she was at the courthouse filing for an emergency protective order. She called a minute later to explain that the judge wouldn't review it until tomorrow morning at the earliest. That meant we had at least 18 hours where Wayne could potentially take Nathan if we couldn't find a legal reason to stop him. I thanked Brooke and hung up, then walked to the nurse's station where 3 nurses were preparing morning medications. I told them Nathan's discharge paperwork needed to be slowed down because I wanted to run additional tests. They looked confused since Nathan's condition had been improving steadily, but they followed my orders without questioning them. I claimed we needed another full blood panel and a nutritional assessment before we could consider discharge. That afternoon, Wayne's lawyer showed up at the hospital with a folder full of legal threats and demanded to speak with Marshall immediately. I watched from the hallway as they met in the administrative conference room, the lawyer's voice carrying through the closed door. Marshall called me in 20 minutes later, and his face told me everything before he even spoke. The lawyer was filing complaints with the state medical board and preparing a lawsuit against the hospital for denying a father access to his child. Marshall kept rubbing his temples while explaining that we had no legal grounds to keep Wayne away without a court order. He said, if I ordered any more unnecessary tests or created any more delays without real medical justification, both the hospital and I personally could face serious legal consequences. The lawyer had already contacted local news stations about a hospital keeping a father from his sick child. Marshall's hands shook slightly as he told me I had until tomorrow morning to either produce legitimate medical reasons for keeping Nathan or prepare him for discharge. I left that meeting knowing I had to make a choice that would destroy my career. Back on the pediatric floor, I sat at the computer terminal staring at Nathan's electronic chart for 10 minutes before my fingers started typing. I documented symptoms that didn't exist: a slight fever of 100, 2 that nobody had measured, an elevated white blood cell count from labs that were never drawn. My hands trembled as I typed false vital signs and created fake nursing notes about Nathan complaining of stomach pain. Each keystroke felt like a betrayal of everything I'd sworn to uphold as a doctor. I added orders for continued IV fluids and observation for possible infection, knowing these lies would buy us maybe another day or two at most. Around midnight, the night nurse, a sharp woman named Carol, who'd worked pediatrics for 20 years, came to find me in the break room. She held a printout of Nathan's chart, and her eyes were full of questions. "These lab results don't make sense," she said quietly. "I didn't see any blood draws ordered today, and the day shift didn't document taking any samples." I told her it must be a clerical error from the lab, and that I'd look into it in the morning. She stared at me for a long moment before nodding slowly, and I knew she didn't believe me, but was choosing not to push it. I stayed in the hospital that night, unable to go home knowing what was coming. At 3 in the morning, my phone rang, and Brooke's panicked voice filled my ear. Wayne's lawyer had filed an emergency motion with family court to force Nathan's immediate release. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m., and given the lack of criminal charges against Wayne, the judge would almost certainly rule in his favor. Brooke said she was trying to reach the prosecutor about expediting abuse charges, but nobody was answering at this hour. I hung up and sat in the dark call room knowing I had less than 6 hours before Wayne would legally take Nathan. That's when I made the decision that would cost me everything, but save Nathan's life. I called Madison at the domestic violence shelter, waking her up to explain the situation. I asked if they could take a child temporarily, even without official custody papers. Madison was quiet for a long moment before saying they had emergency protocols for children in immediate danger. She warned me that taking Nathan without legal authority could be considered kidnapping, since I wasn't his guardian or family. "I understand the risks," I told her, "but I can't let Wayne take him." Madison said she'd prepare a room and have staff ready, but emphasized again that I could face criminal charges for this. At 5 a.m., the pediatric unit was at its quietest, with most patients still asleep and only 2 nurses doing rounds. I went to Nathan's room where he was curled up with a stuffed dinosaur the nurses had given him. I gently woke him and told him we were going on a special field trip to see some nice people who had toys and games. He rubbed his eyes and asked if his mommy would be there. I said she couldn't come right now, but he'd see her soon. Nathan trusted me completely after all these months of treatment and took my hand without question. I helped him into his clothes and grabbed his dinosaur, then walked him down the hallway past the nurse's station. The security guard at the entrance was asleep in his chair, his head tilted back and snoring softly. We walked right past him to the parking garage where my car was waiting. Nathan climbed into the back seat and I realized I didn't even have a booster seat for him. My medical badge and hospital parking pass hung from the rearview mirror as I drove through the empty morning streets. Nathan pressed his face against the window, watching the streetlights pass by. Madison met us at the back entrance of the shelter, a converted Victorian house surrounded by a tall fence. She'd prepared a room with children's books and toys, even a small bed with superhero sheets. Nathan looked confused but not scared, as Madison showed him around the playroom where 2 other children were already playing with blocks. She introduced him to the morning staff who immediately engaged him in a puzzle while I watched from the doorway. "You'll stay here for a little while," I told Nathan. "These nice people will take care of you and you can play with the other kids." He nodded and went back to the puzzle, occasionally looking up to make sure I was still there. Madison pulled me aside and reminded me one more time about the legal consequences of what I'd just done. By 7 a.m., my phone was exploding with calls and texts. Marshall's number appeared over and over on the screen. The hospital had discovered Nathan was missing from his room, and security was reviewing camera footage. They'd found the falsified medical records in the computer system with my login credentials all over them. Marshall's voicemail said hospital security had already called the police, and I needed to return immediately. The footage clearly showed me walking Nathan out of the hospital at 5:15 a.m. I grabbed my phone and dialed Brooke's number while watching Nathan play with the other kids at the shelter. She picked up on the first ring and started yelling before I could even speak. "Where the hell is Nathan? The hospital called saying he's missing and you took him." I told her Nathan was safe at Madison's shelter and that Wayne couldn't get to him there. She went quiet for a moment, then her voice got cold. "You kidnapped a patient. Do you understand what you've done?" I said I understood perfectly and gave her the shelter's address. She said she'd send workers immediately to establish legal custody, but warned me the police were already looking for me. 20 minutes later, 2 police cars pulled up outside the shelter's fence. Madison met them at the gate with her arms crossed, telling them they couldn't enter without a warrant. The officers argued that a child had been kidnapped, but Madison knew the law better than anyone. She kept them standing at the gate while making phone calls to her contacts at legal aid. Nathan watched from the window, confused why police were outside. I knelt down and told him they were just checking to make sure everyone was safe. He went back to playing while Madison bought us time, demanding to see paperwork before allowing anyone inside. The officers radioed for backup and a supervisor while Madison stood firm. She'd dealt with situations like this before, when abusive parents tried to forcibly remove their kids from the shelter. An hour later, Brooke's car screeched into the parking lot. She jumped out, waving papers at the officers, and pushed past them to the gate. "I have an emergency protective order signed by Judge Harrison," she announced. Madison read through every page carefully before nodding and opening the gate. Brooke rushed inside with 2 other CPS workers while the police followed behind them. She found me sitting with Nathan in the playroom, and her face was a mix of relief and anger. "Nathan's officially in CPS custody now," she said. "Wayne can't touch him without going through the courts." The police officers stepped forward, and one of them pulled out handcuffs. "You're under arrest for custodial interference and falsifying medical records," he said. Nathan's eyes went wide as they clicked the cuffs around my wrists. I smiled at him and said everything would be okay, that the nice lady named Viviana was coming to take care of him. Through the window, I saw a woman with gray hair and kind eyes getting out of a minivan. Viviana Montes had been fostering kids for 20 years, and Brooke trusted her completely. She walked in carrying a teddy bear and introduced herself to Nathan with the gentlest voice. The police led me out while Nathan was distracted by the bear and Viviana's warm smile. At the police station, they took my fingerprints and photographed me from every angle. The booking officer read through the charges while I emptied my pockets into a plastic bin. They let me keep my phone long enough to see 43 missed calls from Marshall and a text that said, "You're suspended effective immediately. Termination paperwork to follow." The detective who interviewed me seemed almost sympathetic as I explained why I took Nathan. He said he understood, but that understanding didn't change the law. After 6 hours of processing, they released me on my own recognizance with a court date in 3 weeks. My phone rang the moment I stepped outside, and the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Corey Langley introduced himself as the attorney for the state medical board. His voice was professional, but not harsh, as he explained they needed to schedule an emergency hearing about my license. "What you did shows compassion," he said, "but falsifying records and kidnapping a patient are serious violations we can't ignore." We scheduled the hearing for the following week. Over the next few days, I met with a lawyer named Miles, who specialized in medical license defense. She reviewed my case file and looked at me with sad eyes. "I'll do everything I can," she said, "but keeping your license after admitting to falsifying records is nearly impossible." She explained that the medical board had zero tolerance for documentation fraud, regardless of the reason. We spent hours preparing my defense, focusing on the immediate danger Nathan faced rather than the technical violations. Miles said our best hope was reducing the criminal charges first, which might influence the board's decision. 3 months later, the criminal case finally went to court. Brooke testified about Wayne's history and the danger Nathan faced if he'd been released to his father. She told the judge about Wayne's previous arrests for domestic violence and the restraining orders from 2 ex-girlfriends. The prosecutor agreed to reduce the charges to misdemeanors based on the circumstances. I pleaded guilty to 2 counts of misdemeanor interference and got 18 months probation with 200 hours of community service. The medical board hearing happened 2 weeks after the criminal case concluded. I sat at a long table facing 5 board members while Corey Langley presented the evidence against me. He showed them the falsified lab results I'd entered into Nathan's chart and the security footage of me walking him out of the hospital. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't deny anything. I explained how I'd watched kids get sent back to dangerous homes while waiting for paperwork to process through the system. I told them about a boy named Tyler, who'd ended up in the ICU after being returned to his stepfather during a custody dispute. I described the bruises I'd seen on too many children whose cases were stuck in legal delays. Corey asked why I didn't trust the legal process to protect Nathan. I told him about the 18 hours between when Wayne demanded custody and when the emergency order would be reviewed. 18 hours where Nathan could have been seriously hurt, or worse. The board members looked at each other for a long moment before the chairman called for a vote. One by one, each member raised their hand in favor of revoking my license. The chairman's voice was steady as he read the official decision into the record. I stood up and started gathering my papers while the room stayed silent. As I walked toward the door, one of the board members, an older woman with gray hair, caught my arm. She leaned close and whispered that she would have done the same thing for her own grandchild. Her eyes were wet as she squeezed my hand before letting go. The next morning, I drove to the hospital with empty boxes from the liquor store. Security had already deactivated my badge, so I had to wait at the front desk for an escort. Marshall met me in the lobby with a temporary visitor pass and walked me to what used to be my office. The nameplate was already gone from the door. I started with the diplomas on the wall, wrapping each one in newspaper before placing them in boxes. My medical school diploma went in first, then my residency certificates, then years of continuing education awards. The desk drawers held patient thank you cards I'd saved over the years. photos from the hospital charity events where we'd raised money for new equipment, a coffee mug Nathan had painted for me during one of his stays that said, "World's Best Doctor," in shaky kid handwriting. 3 nurses from the pediatric ward showed up while I was packing. They hugged me one by one and told me I'd done the right thing. Sarah, who'd worked the most shifts with Nathan, pressed a card into my hand that the whole nursing staff had signed. Inside, they'd written that sometimes doing what's right means breaking the rules. More people stopped by as word spread that I was cleaning out my office. The janitor who'd always chatted with me during late nights shook my hand. The cafeteria lady who knew my usual order brought me a free lunch one last time. Even some doctors who'd criticized my decision publicly stopped in to say goodbye privately. By afternoon, I had 6 boxes stacked on a cart. Marshall walked me out to my car and helped me load everything into the trunk. He said the hospital's lawyers were still sorting through the liability issues, but he didn't think they'd pursue any civil action against me. 2 weeks later, my landlord called about the lease. Without a steady income, I couldn't afford the rent anymore. She agreed to let me break the lease early if I forfeited my security deposit and paid 1 extra month. I spent the weekend packing up my apartment, selling furniture on Craigslist and arranging for movers. My parents drove down to help me move back into my childhood bedroom. Mom had cleared out her sewing room, and Dad had already set up my old twin bed. They didn't say much about my situation, but I could see the disappointment in their eyes when they looked at all those boxes of medical certificates. Dad just patted my shoulder and said we'd figure things out. Mom made my favorite dinner that first night back home. We ate in silence, except for the sound of forks on plates. After a month of living with my parents, Brooke called with an update about Nathan. She said he was doing amazing with Viviana, who had fostered dozens of traumatized kids over the years. Nathan had started weekly therapy sessions with a child psychologist who specialized in abuse cases. He was eating normally again and had even gained some weight. Viviana had enrolled him in a small preschool program where he was slowly learning to trust other adults. Brooke mentioned that Nathan still asked about his parents sometimes, but was adjusting better than anyone expected. The criminal case against Elise moved through the courts over the next several weeks. Her lawyer argued that she was a victim of domestic violence who'd made desperate choices to protect her child. The prosecutor agreed to a plea deal for probation instead of jail time. At her sentencing, the judge ordered 18 months of probation with mandatory therapy twice a week. She also had to complete a parenting class and submit to regular drug testing. The judge said he recognized that Elise's actions came from a place of fear, but that poisoning a child could never be acceptable. Elise cried through the whole hearing. Meanwhile, Wayne hired a team of expensive lawyers to fight for custody of Nathan. He filed motion after motion, claiming he'd been falsely accused and that his parental rights were being violated. His lawyers demanded access to all of Nathan's medical records and questioned every diagnosis. They argued that Elise had turned everyone against Wayne with her lies. The custody battle dragged on for 2 months with hearing after hearing. Wayne showed up to court in expensive suits, playing the part of a concerned father. His lawyers painted him as a victim of a conspiracy between his mentally ill wife and an overzealous doctor. I got subpoenaed to testify at one of the custody hearings. Wayne's lawyer grilled me for 2 hours about my lost medical license, trying to paint me as unreliable. He asked why anyone should believe someone who'd admitted to falsifying medical records. I kept my answers focused on Nathan's safety and what Elise had told me about the abuse. During a break in the hearing, the prosecutor pulled me aside with surprising news. 2 of Wayne's ex-girlfriends had contacted her office after seeing news coverage of the case. Both women had filed police reports years ago about Wayne's violent behavior. One had hospital records from when he'd broken her wrist. The other had photos of bruises and a restraining order. When court resumed, both women testified about Wayne's pattern of violence. The judge's face got harder with each story they told. Wayne's lawyers tried to discredit them, but the evidence was overwhelming. The judge ordered a full investigation into Wayne's history and extended the protective order keeping him away from Nathan. After the hearing, Madison from the shelter found me in the courthouse hallway. She said she'd been following the case and wanted to offer me a job. The shelter needed someone to do intake paperwork and help run activities for the kids staying there. The pay was barely above minimum wage, but she thought my medical background would be valuable. I started the next week, working 4 days at the shelter. Most of my time went to filling out forms and organizing supplies, but twice a week I got to lead art therapy sessions with the children. These kids had seen things no child should see, but they still laughed when we finger painted. 2 months passed with Nathan living at Viviana's house. Brooke called regularly with updates about his progress. He was having fewer nightmares and had started kindergarten at the local elementary school. Viviana said he'd made 2 friends and was even invited to a birthday party. His therapist reported that Nathan was slowly processing the trauma, but showing remarkable resilience. He still asked about his mom and dad sometimes, especially at bedtime, but was learning to feel safe in his new home. 2 weeks later, Viviana called me at 3 a.m. with panic in her voice. Wayne had shown up at her house drunk and pounding on the door demanding to see Nathan. She'd already called 911, but wanted me to know what was happening. I could hear him yelling in the background while Nathan cried upstairs. The police arrived within minutes and found Wayne trying to break down the back door with a crowbar. They tackled him to the ground and cuffed him while he screamed about his rights as a father. Viviana had to hold Nathan while he watched through the window as his dad got shoved into the police car. The restraining order violation was clear, and this time the judge didn't give Wayne another chance. At his arraignment, the prosecutor showed security footage from Viviana's doorbell camera of Wayne threatening to burn the house down if she didn't let him in. The judge ordered him held without bail until trial. I sat in the courtroom watching Wayne's face turn red as he realized he'd finally gone too far. After that night, I couldn't sleep properly anymore. My hands would shake when I thought about what could have happened if Viviana hadn't had good locks. Madison convinced me to see a therapist who specialized in healthcare workers dealing with trauma. The first session, I just sat there unable to speak for 20 minutes. The therapist waited patiently until I finally told her about falsifying Nathan's records and losing everything I'd worked for. She didn't judge me or tell me I'd done the wrong thing. Instead, she asked me to describe what would have happened if I hadn't acted. We spent weeks working through the guilt and anger I felt toward the system that had failed Nathan. She helped me understand that sometimes protecting someone means sacrificing yourself. During one session, she asked if I regretted my choice, and I said no, without hesitation. Brooke visited me at the shelter one afternoon with news from the hospital. Because of Nathan's case, they'd completely changed how they handled suspected abuse. Marshall had pushed through new protocols that created a rapid response team. Now, when doctors suspected abuse, they could activate the team within hours instead of waiting days for bureaucracy. The team included security, social workers, and legal advisors who could make immediate decisions about child safety. 3 other children had already been protected using the new system. She said the nurses called it the Nathan Protocol unofficially. 3 months after losing my medical license, I filled out applications for counseling programs. My savings were running low, and I needed a new career path. The admissions officer at the state university looked confused when she saw my medical degree on the application. I explained about losing my license and wanting to help kids in a different way. She scheduled me for an interview with the program director, who spent 2 hours asking about my experience with traumatized children. They accepted me immediately, and even offered a partial scholarship based on my unique background. The counseling classes felt strange at first after years of medical training. Instead of learning about medications and procedures, I studied therapeutic techniques and child psychology. My professors quickly realized I brought a different perspective to discussions. When we talked about medical trauma, I could explain exactly what hospitalized children experienced. During role-playing exercises, I knew which questions to ask because I'd seen hundreds of scared kids. One professor pulled me aside after class to say I was exactly the kind of student they wanted in the program. A month into my studies, I got a letter forwarded from the hospital. Elise had written from her treatment facility where she was doing intensive therapy. Her handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. She thanked me for protecting Nathan even though she'd caused the whole situation. She wrote about finally understanding why she'd chosen poison instead of leaving Wayne. Her therapist helped her see how the abuse had twisted her thinking until hurting Nathan seemed like protecting him. She was working through her own childhood trauma and learning to forgive herself. She hoped someday Nathan might forgive her too. The letter made me cry in my car outside the shelter. Wayne's trial happened faster than expected because his lawyer convinced him to take a plea deal. He got 6 months in county jail for violating the protective order and threatening Viviana. During his time inside, the family court moved forward with terminating his parental rights. The judge reviewed the evidence, including the arrest at Viviana's house and his history of violence. Wayne appeared by video link from jail trying to argue he deserved another chance. The judge cut him off and said Nathan's safety came first. The termination was finalized before Wayne even got out of jail. Viviana called me crying happy tears when she got the news about Wayne's rights being terminated. She'd been thinking about Nathan's future and had made a decision. She wanted to adopt him permanently and give him the stable home he deserved. Nathan had been with her for months now, and they'd formed a real bond. He called her kids his brother and sister. He had his own room decorated with dinosaurs. She'd already talked to a lawyer about starting the adoption process. The state invited me to testify at a legislative hearing about child protection reform. They wanted to hear from people with direct experience about how the system had failed kids. I wore my only suit and sat at a long table facing state senators and representatives. I told them about Nathan without using his real name. I explained how the system moved too slow when children were in immediate danger. I described watching Elise poison her son because she thought it was better than letting Wayne hurt him. Several legislators asked hard questions about why I'd broken the law, and I answered honestly. One senator said my testimony had changed her mind about emergency intervention protocols. My counseling professors heard about the legislative testimony through news coverage. They called me into a meeting that I thought meant trouble. Instead, they offered to fast-track certain requirements based on my medical background and real experience. They waived some basic courses and let me test out of others. They assigned me to advanced practicums working directly with traumatized children. The program director said my unique perspective would help countless kids in the future. During my practicum at a children's therapy center, I worked with a therapist treating Nathan. She couldn't discuss his case, but Nathan recognized me immediately. He ran over and hugged my legs before showing me his latest drawing. It was a picture of him standing with Viviana under a bright rainbow with birds flying overhead. The therapist mentioned it was the first truly happy picture he'd drawn since everything started. Nathan grabbed my hand and pulled me to see his other drawings on the wall, pointing out every detail with excitement. 6 months passed faster than I expected, and the day finally came when I stood in the courthouse watching Viviana sign the adoption papers, while Nathan sat next to her swinging his legs and humming some cartoon theme song. The judge asked Nathan if he wanted Viviana to be his mom forever, and he nodded, so hard I thought his head might fall off before running to hug her legs. The bailiff took pictures while the social worker stamped forms and handed Viviana the official certificate with Nathan's new last name printed at the top. That same week, Elise finished her treatment program, and the court approved her first supervised visit with Nathan at the CPS office downtown. I watched through the observation window as Nathan hid behind Viviana for the first 10 minutes before slowly warming up when Elise pulled out his favorite toy dinosaur from her purse. She sat on the floor, letting him show her how the dinosaur could roar, and by the end of the hour, he was sitting next to her building blocks, while the supervisor took notes. 2 weeks later, I walked across the stage at my counseling program graduation, wearing the cap and gown over my only suit, while my parents took pictures from the audience. The program director handed me my diploma and whispered that 3 different children's advocacy centers had already called asking about me. My story had spread through the professional network, and everyone wanted someone who understood both the medical and emotional sides of child trauma cases. Wayne got released from county jail on a Thursday morning, and by Friday afternoon, the police were at Elise's apartment complex, responding to neighbors' calls about him pounding on her door and screaming threats. The officers found him trying to jimmy the lock with a screwdriver and arrested him for violating the protective order and attempted breaking and entering. The parole board sent him back to prison for 18 months this time with no chance of early release. I accepted the position at the Children's Trauma Center the following Monday and spent my first day filling out paperwork and meeting the team of therapists and social workers. My supervisor showed me around the facility, pointing out the play therapy rooms and the special interview spaces designed to help kids feel safe while talking about scary things. She mentioned 3 times that my medical background combined with counseling training made me exactly what they needed for their most complex cases. Marshall Bishop's name showed up on my phone one evening while I was eating leftover Chinese food and watching TV in my small apartment. He told me the hospital board had voted to name their new rapid response protocol the Nathan Initiative, and it guaranteed any child with suspected abuse would get protective intervention within 4 hours maximum. He said what I did was wrong, but it forced them to fix a broken system, and maybe that was worth something. Almost a year to the day after everything started, Viviana sent me a photo of Nathan at his birthday party, wearing a paper crown and grinning with chocolate cake all over his face. Other kids surrounded him at a picnic table in her backyard while he blew out 7 candles and everyone clapped and cheered. She wrote that he was doing great in 1st grade and had joined the soccer team and barely ever had nightmares anymore. Brooke and I ended up working together constantly since the trauma center partnered with CPS on most of their cases. We'd sit in case meetings discussing treatment plans, and she'd always mention how she'd never met anyone who gave up so much for one child. During those long days working cases together, she became one of my closest friends and the only person who really understood why I threw away my medical career. Madison and I started having coffee after our case consultations turned into longer conversations about everything from our favorite movies to our shared frustration with the system. 6 months of friendship turned into her asking if I wanted to try a real date, and a year later, we were planning our wedding at the same courthouse where Nathan's adoption was finalized. She never once questioned my decision to break the law for Nathan and said it showed her exactly the kind of person I was. The medical school ethics professor called one afternoon, asking if I'd be willing to have my case included in their curriculum as a study in moral dilemmas and professional boundaries. Students would read about Nathan's situation and debate what they would have done in my position and whether protecting a child justified breaking medical protocols and losing a license. I agreed, because maybe some future doctor would remember Nathan's story when faced with their own impossible choice between following rules and saving a life. 2 years passed before the thick envelope from the medical board showed up at my apartment on a Tuesday afternoon. I opened it standing in my kitchen and found 3 pages explaining how my case had started major discussions about changing emergency rules for doctors dealing with abuse cases. They weren't giving me my license back, but they wanted me to know that new guidelines were being written that would let doctors act faster when kids were in danger. The letter mentioned the Nathan Initiative by name and said hospitals across the state were training staff on the new rapid response protocols. I sat down at my kitchen table and read it 3 more times before calling Madison to tell her the news. The next week, Viviana brought Nathan to visit me at the trauma center, where I'd been working for over a year. He walked through the door wearing a soccer uniform with grass stains on his knees and a huge smile on his face. At 7 years old, he looked nothing like the sick, scared kid I'd carried out of the hospital that night. He showed me his report card with all A's and B's and told me about scoring 2 goals in his last game. Viviana said he hadn't had any health problems since the poisoning stopped, and his therapist was amazed at how well he'd adjusted. Nathan played with the toys in my office while Viviana and I talked about his progress in the school and how he'd made 3 best friends in his class. Before they left, Nathan gave me a drawing he'd made of himself playing soccer with "Thank you" written in green crayon at the top. Around the same time, Elise sent me a letter from the domestic violence shelter, where she'd started working after completing her treatment program. She wrote about helping other women escape bad situations and how she finally understood that poisoning Nathan wasn't the answer to Wayne's abuse. She'd been in therapy twice a week for 2 years and was taking medication for anxiety and depression. Her supervisor at the shelter said she was one of their best counselors because she really understood what the women were going through. Elise included a photo of herself at the shelter's fundraising walk, looking healthy and smiling for the first time since I'd known her. Madison and I had been together for almost 2 years when I decided to propose at the same shelter where I'd brought Nathan that terrifying morning. I arranged it with the shelter director who helped me set up candles in the courtyard where we'd first really talked about our future together. Madison said yes immediately and started crying when I told her I wanted to get married there because it was where something terrible had turned into something beautiful. We set the date for 6 months later and invited everyone who'd helped save Nathan, including Brooke and Viviana, and even some of the nurses from the hospital. The children's advocacy group called 3 months before our wedding to tell me I was getting their annual Courage Award for protecting Nathan. Standing at the podium in front of 200 people, I kept my speech short and just said that any doctor would have done the same thing if they'd seen what I saw. The award came with a scholarship fund in Nathan's name for medical students interested in child advocacy work. After the ceremony, a reporter asked if I regretted losing my license, and I told her I'd make the same choice again without thinking twice about it. Nathan was 8 when he sent me a letter written in careful pencil on lined paper from the school. He wrote that Viviana had explained what happened when he was little, and he wanted to thank me for keeping him safe from his dad. His handwriting was neat, and he'd drawn little hearts around the edges of the paper. Viviana called later to say he'd worked on the letter for 3 days and insisted on mailing it himself at the post office. She said he'd started asking questions about why he didn't live with his birth parents, and they'd decided he was old enough to understand the truth in simple terms. 5 years after that night at the hospital, I was sitting in my office as the director of the trauma center when my assistant brought in the mail. There was a graduation announcement from Nathan's middle school with a note from Viviana saying he wanted to be a doctor to help kids like him. Madison and I had 2 kids of our own by then, and Nathan had become like an older brother to them at family gatherings Viviana brought him to. He was 13 and taller than me already, with plans to try out for the high school basketball team. Looking at his school photo, I could barely remember the sick, frightened 5-year-old I'd treated all those years ago. That evening, Madison and I took our kids to the park, and I pushed them on the swings thinking about everything that had happened. Losing my medical license had hurt more than I could have imagined, but Nathan was alive and happy and free from fear. He had a mom who loved him and friends and dreams for his future. That was worth any price I had to pay, and I'd never once regretted choosing his safety over my career. So yeah, that's pretty much the story. Thanks for hanging out. It always feels chill sharing these with you. Catch you around next time.